Hello, and welcome to my presentation about the final 504. So this is Casey Tallman Anderson for Scoun 670 class. All right, so to begin, the student will be referred to as Jane Doe. I try to keep the name as generic as possible in order to keep the student's name confidential. So Jane is a 15-year-old student that is currently in the 10th grade at our high school, and Jane just moved to our area from out of state. Due to the student just moving here, her friend group is not yet fully developed. Jane previously lived in the area, but is currently unsure if the friends she used to have are attending the same high school, as she has not been in touch with them because she moved at when she was in the lower grade levels. So currently the family dynamic isn't healthy, but is becoming healthy. So painting the picture, Jane is adopted by her biological grandmother and her grandmother's second husband. The student does not have a relationship with her biological parental mother and father. Jane's grandmother's second husband was verbally, mentally, physically abusive towards both the student and the guardian. Jane's grandmother recently divorced her second husband and received full custody of Jane. The second husband is currently being investigated, and since Jane's grandmother now has full custody, they moved out of state. Through the court case, the judge and the student's therapist recommended a court-ordered 504 due to the medical diagnosis in order to receive accommodations and class support. The areas of concern that are identified and diagnosed by Jane's therapist are anxiety and depression. Due to the diagnosis of anxiety and depression, Jane's impact on student learning is greatly impacted. Jane states that she often needs to leave class as she has anxiety attacks and feels as if the world is collapsing in around her. During these attacks, Jane is unable to focus on anything around her other than fleeing the area. Jane is currently needing to leave class at least 3 times a week in order to self-regulate. Because of this, Jane is missing classroom instruction time and feels that her grades are falling behind. During the enrollment meeting, the guardian and student discussed the court-ordered 504 and the recommendations from Jane's therapist. The counselor documented this notice. The counselor then reached out to Jane and her grandma about a month into school with the release of information form for the guardian to give to the therapist in order for the school counselor to receive the medical diagnosis as well as be able to converse and communicate with the therapist. Upon receiving the medical diagnosis, the counselor set up a meeting for the initial 504. And then the background of that, the counselor began creating and composing the initial 504. So admin, teachers, guardian, student, and student's therapist, as well as the counselor, because they're composing the 504, were invited to the meeting. During the meeting, the initial 504 was reviewed by the team. Just to give you a glance here, this is kind of what that form would look like. So really kind of quick overview would be starting the meeting by identifying why everyone is there, what will be reviewed during the agenda, and then what that process looks like. So again, keeping this generic, there wasn't a student name that I could put in. That's why it's coming up as a student name is not found. But this is where Jane's name would go, her date of birth, her student ID at her current high school, what school she's attend, who is her counselor, what grade she's in, what is the date of this 504 meeting, which will also be the initial eligibility because this is a new 504. And then this annual review date will be a year after this first meeting. And then the 3-year renewal will be 3 years after this first meeting. And then identifying the purpose of today's 504 meeting. So this is an initial eligibility meeting because this is the first time that we're meeting to talk about a 504 with the diagnosis and with medical documentation. So going through these questions regarding the mental or physical impairment, so just simply states, does the student have a current physical or mental impairment under Section 504? Yes, the student does because of the medical diagnosis of anxiety and depression. And yes, the medical provider's eligibility statement is on file. And then identifying factors that are affected for this student. So identified previously in the slides, the student is having anxiety attacks and is needing to leave class and feels that the world is kind of collapsing in around her. So that would be the concentration and the focus and those factors. And then the next question, does the student's impairment substantially limit one or more major life activities? And yes, it does. And the statement here explains why. So previously stated, Jane's educational experience is impacted as the student often needs to leave class in order to have a break in a desired space due to anxiety attack. That states that statement there. And then continuing with the 504, this is really where the team determination and decisions come in. So the team's able to talk about, well, does the student, are they eligible for a 504? Are they not eligible? Or do we just need to look into some other like tier 1 supports for this student? So for this meeting, the team determined that Jane is eligible for a 504 plan and accommodations. And then the accommodations are listed here, but I'll go back to the slide to explain them in just a moment. And then also during this meeting, notes are taken just to document what was stated, what occurred during this meeting, and this can be referred to by the counselor if anything's needing to be coming up or reviewed. And then for this question here, it's reviewing the educational placement that best meets the needs of the student. For Jane currently, it is the educational classroom, but with accommodations. And then you have the signature of the team members, so who attended, they sign off on it. And then for the parent or guardian, there are a couple more spots for them to sign as it is a legal document. So we need to have documentation that the parent was there and received the information and they signed off on it. Guardians and students also have rights being under a Section 504. So those rights should be reviewed during meetings. And then if parent asks, they can also be sent home. So going back to the PowerPoint, and reviewing the accommodations. So this team identified that break cards, the use of the calming den, and extended time on assignments, as well as teachers' permission to listen to music would be accessible to the student in the classroom. So the idea was that the break card would be used to signify to the teachers that Jane may be having an anxiety attack and is leaving the classroom to go either to the calming den or check in with the counselor instead of Jane just walking out of the classroom and then teachers wondering where the student is. And then the extended time on assignments is to support the time that Jane is currently missing in class and will allow for the student to receive extra support from the tutoring center in order to complete assignments. All right, moving forward, Jane and the team will implement the accommodations. The team is hopeful that as Jane continues to work with her therapist weekly and use the accommodations, that she will have less anxiety attacks and that she will be able to stay in classes for the full period. Yes, I want to identify, we need to figure out what the root cause of the anxiety attacks are in order to present that with the student and help her work through that. However, knowing that she has a therapist, I personally feel, and without the therapist fully disclosing, that these conversations are taking place with the therapist. And then the support will be offered through the use of the student advocating for herself, receiving the supports and techniques from her therapist, as well as checking in with her school counselor during those break times that she has, as well as when the school counselor feels as needed, just to touch base with the student. All right, so during this process, the role of the counselor includes coordinating the meeting, collecting data and reviewing student cumulative file, as well as connecting with the student's therapist. The counselor composes the initial 504, so like that form that I showed you. The template is already there, but the counselor goes in and fills in the information. The counselor also leads the initial meeting, the annual meeting, as well as the triannual meeting that takes place every 3 years. The counselor is also the one that implements the 504 and advocates for the student by checking in with the student to make sure that accommodations are in compliance, as well as the guardian. It's really the gatekeeper for this information and providing that to the teachers and letting them know that the student needs some extra supports currently.